Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we're joined by Desh Amila. He was one of the co-directors of Islam and the Future of Tolerance, alongside Jay Shapiro, someone who's also been on the show. He's currently the producer of the documentary Better Left Unsaid. We talk about his documentary, both the far left and the far right, the identity politics that is at play, and more. You can help fund his documentary through the link in the description of the video below. You can also help this channel by becoming a Patreon or buying some merch. Anyways, hope you enjoy the video.
Shut up and sit down.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, and today we're joined by Desh Amila. Desh is the founder of This 42. He's a filmmaker and he's the co-director of Islam and the Future of Tolerance alongside Jay Shapiro. His most recent work is a documentary that he is producing titled Better Left Unsaid, and it will be the focal point of this conversation. Mr. Amila, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I am glad that you've seen my previous movie as well. So looking forward to telling you about this new project.
Yeah, so that's actually where we first met. It was at the premiere of Islam and the Future of Tolerance back in Los Angeles a couple of years ago, back when we could actually leave the house without having to be concerned about any particular pandemic that may or may not be going on at this time.
And I could travel because I came all the way from Australia for that premiere.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Oh, that's a long flight there. How has I'm actually interested, how has the pandemic changed the filming process for this? Because I'm assuming you probably have a lot of hurdles to jump over now.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting evolution of the whole industry. The industry is been forced to change. This movie has number of previously, they were meant to be in-person interviews, but we didn't want to wait. So there are a number of interviews done over Zoom, and we've used some cinema trickery to make it look high quality.
Oh, that's actually pretty great, actually. So very, very nice sleight of hand there. And so what's the general, actually, you wanted to mention that you're the producer of this film, actually. You're not the director.
Yes.
So what is the story behind that? Okay,
so Islam and the Future of Tolerance, I had a directorial capacity because it was originally based on footage from an event that I produced. I used to, I founded and ran an organization in Australia called Think Inc. for a number of years, which was Australia's largest intellectual touring company. And we toured Sam and Majid. That was the genesis of that film. So I directed all the groundwork, and I directed some scenes. And then I, agreed to produce it because Jay Shapiro approached me and say, let's turn this into a film. Because my plan was to just put that footage up on YouTube just as some clips. I wasn't thinking about a feature documentary. With this film, a gentleman from Canada by the name of Kurt Jaimungal, who was a fan of my first movie, reached out to me, basically emailed me saying, hey, really big fan of your first movie. I'd like some advice. I'm making my first movie. Can you help? And I generally have a habit of, anytime an independent filmmaker reaches out, or anyone for that matter, I try my best to give some time. So we exchanged a few emails, set up a few phone calls. I gave some free advice. And then he eventually shared the very early concept video he had. When I watched it, I was actually quite surprised, and I saw the potential of what this could be. And I reached out to him and say, hey, if you're serious about this, I can come on board, but I will re-edit this. I will change this around. And he was more than happy. So I jumped on board as a producer and an editor and changed the movie around. The base concept was written and directed by Kurt, and I did the finishing work on the film. So I'm very much a producer on this, and I'm still working. My team is doing all the post-production. The film is almost ready, and Kurt is doing some work in Canada. So it's slightly different approach. And another thing because of that is the movie is presented in 4 chapters. There's going to be 2 versions of the film that's going to come out. One version is the director's cut, which is a little bit over 2 hours. And then there's going to be another cut, which I had a lot to do with, which is about 90 minutes, an hour and a half instead of 2. And that is purely because chapter 4 of the film, Kurt and I disagree how to end the film. And so there's the thing about this is, see, right now, you have the global media landscape has fundamentally changed, and social media played and continue to play a crucial role. And with that comes this, you are given a curated reality, and that's the world you exist in. And you don't tend to see much of the other side, but if you do see the other side, it's very much a caricature of the other side. And it's quite frustrating to witness. It happens so often, and you have to go to enormous lengths to see both sides. So the reason I'm mentioning this is Kurt came to me, presented me an idea, which I could clearly see the potential, but I knew I disagreed the way he ended the film. But I really appreciated what he's trying to do. He's trying to have a good faith attempt at tackling an incredibly difficult subject matter. And I knew I know I have a certain amount of resources and I can get this out in a meaningful way. And that's why I'm coming on board. Even the 90-minute version, I don't agree with the conclusion of my own film, but I do support and putting all my resources behind getting this movie out, because this is a good faith attempt at something, and it is a long form, well-researched attempt at a number of complicated subject matter. And yeah, that's why I'm the producer, and that's why this is going to be quite an interesting film for a number of reasons, because this will get a lot of people talking. And Kurt and I will have many conversations, and I'd love you to have Kurt on this podcast at some point. He will present his version of the story and his perspective, why he picked that ending.
Mm-hmm. I think that's actually fantastic, and I would absolutely love to have Kurt on. Actually, I'll probably reach out to him after this. But the idea, the good faith conversations, the idea that we should understand the opposition side, the idea that we should have this conversation in a way that we are not, as you said, just performing a caricature of what it is the other person said. That was also kind of a theme of Islam and the Future of Tolerance, where you had Majid Nawaz, who himself is a Muslim, and Sam Harris, who's an atheist and an anti-theist, if you want to label that. These are people who have two completely different understandings of reality, yet they're coming together to have an honest conversation about a problem that they both recognize. And so for the sake of familiarizing my audience with the documentary, what is the general thesis of this documentary, and what was the catalyzing enzyme of why you wanted to talk about this?
So Better Left Unsaid is a political thesis about politics of the West. It tells you the story for most of us have forgotten. If you look at the conversation about the history of how certain politics have come to be what it is. For example, one of the simplest way to put forth what this movie is about is this. If you ask an average person, what does the political far right stand for? It's relatively simple. They haven't changed their tune since they decided to try to take over the world, over 100 years ago. Political far right ideology, the superiority of one group of people, and everything sort of stems from that. But if you ask the question from an average person, what does the political far left, I'm talking about the furthest of the left, stand for? It's not that simple anymore, because some of those furthest of the left, Marxist ideology, it's sort of seeped into the modern left in a quite an interesting way, where well-meaning liberals, small L liberals, I am a small L liberal, tend to use certain rhetoric, certain languages, promoting things that they may have not thought through. So the movie tried to explain the origins of certain thinking, and then how that thinking led to certain movements, and what this could end up being because of that. So it looks at the far left with a we're having a quite a detailed, hard look at that, and then we are comparing it to and showing how the far right is getting their ideas, and application of those ideas are like. And then right at the end, we try to present a potential solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting analysis, because even though, as you said, we can pretty much have a good understanding of what the far right is because it hasn't evolved as much as you would expect, the far left, this new phenomenon that sort of originated around 2013, 14, 15, it's something that we haven't seen before. And Jonathan Haidt has done his best to sort of analyze it and what happened, as well as James Lindsay, how it manifested itself in the academy in the 1960s and then in the 1990s. And so it's super interesting to see people tackle this in completely different manners. You have people like Ben Shapiro attacking them from a like Judeo-Christian perspective. And then you have James Lindsay attacking it more from an academic perspective. But it's so difficult to really grasp your head around what exactly it is that we're talking about. What is it that, we're trying to tackle, and what perspective would be the best way to tackle it? So from your point of view, what would you say? And we'll do our best to navigate around not spoiling the film. But what the best way to tackle this far left, regressive left, whatever you want to describe it as a return to values that are espoused in Christianity, or is there a secular approach that we can tackle it for?
See, I have a secular view of the world. I'm an atheist myself. I've had a quite colorful journey through various religions and ended up being an atheist. But I do know Kurt is still going through that journey. So ultimately, though, the film is presented through a secular lens. I think regardless of what certain one side of politics, or actually both sides of politics, say as fake news, we still have objective reality. We can still ground certain ideas on reason, and that's the approach I'm taking here. And James Lindsay, he's in the film, so he presents his point of view, but we put all of those points in a meaningful way, so users can walk away with a certain set of knowledge and language. And I want to be very clear, just like Islam and the Future of Tolerance, this is an exercise in conversation and language more than anything, because Islam and the Future of Tolerance didn't necessarily give you a clear cut, here are 12 rules to how to avoid this. That's not what it is all about. And this is also not necessarily giving you quite specific answers, but presenting it in a reason and secular views, a grounded manner, where this is coming from. I mean, the idea of most of the ideas that the far left is pushing out, they're not new, and that's the key. They are presented with maybe new wordings and new wrapping, but most of them are quite old ideas, and they're grounded in certain set of ideas, where Marxist ideas, postmodern ideas that existed for quite a long time. It's just as you presented it, they've seen a resurgence recently and popularization of these ideas in a very pop-friendly way. But the reality is, some of these ideas are extremely dangerous, and they do not stand up to Enlightenment values and what the Western value system that has made the West that we live in. It has an inherent intention of dismantling that, breaking it down. Yeah, it's grounded in this idea, just like, in the extreme jihadist movements, it pits one against the other. In the jihadist movement, what ISIS and the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda's, Al-Shabaab, all of them cleverly did was present this argument as Muslims against the world, right? Now, what the furthest of the left present is, it is the bourgeoisie, it's the oppressor versus the commoner, the peasant. That narrative, that everything is presented through that narrative, and this perceived battle then becomes, this really attractive notion to many people. You are fighting the system. That is inherent in the line of thinking. I don't know if I really answered your question, but I just that's what we're trying to get through the film.
Mm-hmm. No, and it makes perfect sense. One of the things that really worries me is that you mentioned earlier the concept of objective reality. One of the huge problems is that many of these people adopt, as you said, a very postmodern, a very Kuhnian view of reality, in which things are more of a matter of either scientific revolutions or anything that is based on a heavy sociological influence on us, so much so to the point where our sociology tells us what is true and what is not true, rather than any objective mechanism that we can enforce to let us determine, okay, this is clearly true, this is clearly not true. They'll say, well, whether or not you were born and raised in an upper middle class family, or whether or not you were born and raised in a neighborhood that has a lot of socioeconomic problems, in which it is unlikely that you're going to be able to succeed in life, that is more a reliable factor in determining what is not true. So if that's the case, we're effectively trying to argue against somebody that doesn't really value evidence that is rooted in the scientific method or science. And it reminds me of the quote that is often that I often give. It comes from Sam Harris, where it's like, if you're talking with someone who doesn't value evidence, what evidence are you going to show them that evidence is valuable? So I don't know how to tackle these sorts of people. And these people are at the center of, as you said, like this Marxist postmodern view that we're dealing with. This is specifically aimed more towards the academic far left. How do we convince these people that objective reality exists?
See, the beauty of, or the pernicious nature of postmodernism is it replaced modernism with this idea there are no truth claims. That's the thing that they go after. Everything is suspect. Everything is suspicious. Everything can be broken down or deconstructed, right? See, the problem with that is then you don't have a place to stand. Like, you can't start a conversation. I mean, the key thing that I've learned in my life, and as you mentioned from Sam and people like him, is if you want to have a conversation that has some semblance of progression, you both have to, you and the person you're having the conversation with, have to have a starting point you agree on. This is where we're going to start, and this is where we're going to try to get to, at least, right? Your point is this, my point is this, let's figure it out. But when you have, as you correctly point out, these postmodernist Marxist academic thinkers, that's not the starting point. Their starting point is every assertion you're going to make they have a way to deconstruct it. In other words, sort of, they crumble the foundation of the conversation, thus the conversation cannot move forward. But if you have an understanding of how they do that, then you have a way of using language to explain to them. Now, the key thing here, it's not about evidence, right? Now, I know, yes, Sam will put his arm up and go, what? But the reality here is, it's in the point you made. If they don't value evidence and objective truths, what do they value? So what they value is the language they use. And they're clever with language. Postmodernism gives you incredible set of tools that are it's just rhetoric, right? If you can figure out what that rhetoric means, and if you can, my simple way of dealing with this is, I won't try to progress a conversation without setting certain boundaries. There's a famous video of Richard Dawkins having a conversation, or attempting to have a conversation, with Mahdi Hussein, where he asked the question, Mahdi, do you believe Muhammad, when he died, he got on a winged horse and flew to heaven, literally? And he wanted a yes or no answer. Like, when he got the answer, when Mahdi actually admitted, like, that is, yes, he believed literally that happened, then the audience got an idea, well, if this is a person who believes that is a literal thing that happened, then you can figure out what else is going to happen. So one of the things that is key is to first listen to what they have to say, and then based on what they've just said, trying to build a baseline that you both agree, then you move forward. Then you can try to bring in evidence. But the challenge is, moving forward is going to be quite difficult, because there's tons of far left academics who don't like studies and evidence, because there was a movement for a short time. I'm so glad it was only a short time, that they want to dismantle STEM. The current way of studies and peer review is done because it is inherently the sexist or racist, or one of the issues that they put forth. But ultimately, I do believe, and I don't want to use the word faith, but for the purposes of this conversation, I do have faith in Enlightenment values and what the West has done for many hundreds of years. It is strong enough, the foundation is strong enough to stand up if we have the right tools, and if we understand who we are talking to. Okay, I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but this is super important, right? Both on the left and the right, there's a spectrum in the middle, who are center left and center right. Even within these groups, there's this terrible, terrible habit, which is, we don't tend to read information coming out of the political other side, right? So, for example, anyone from the left will just completely discount whatever Breitbart writes, right? Yes, Breitbart is full of completely bonkers, unreliable information. But you got to understand, though, millions of people find that information useful. If you can just look at, if you're going to look at a set of information, have a look at the same set of information, how the other side is reporting the same thing. The more you start doing that, you're going to start noticing, hold on, I didn't know about that point of argument, because every media outlet or every vlogger or any person you're getting the information from, regardless how intellectually honest they are, we all have our own biases, and we all gather a certain set of information based on somewhat of confirmation bias, and we present it as this is all of it. But then you find out there may be some truth to some of these claims, it is important. And again, that's one of the things that in the movie we present in various different ways, is that we have to get over this really terrible idea that when you otherize a group of people, you can ignore them and you don't read them, you don't want to know anything about them. You will never understand the other side if you completely ignore them.
Mm-hmm. This ties into the sort of idea that Jonathan Haidt tries to convey, this us versus them mentality, where it's so much more effective if we consider everybody as a collective us, and we recognize that we all have problems and we're attempting to solve them. Whereas if you create this them mentality, this othering mentality, then you've just constructed an enemy. And it's overwhelmingly unlikely that we're going to be able to make any progress, any genuine progress. And you brought up an interesting point there that I've been trying to hammer into some people these past couple of months, where what a lot of people just do is they'll, if you're on the right, if you're a conservative, and you only listen to conservative media, whether we're talking about Steven Crowder or Ben Shapiro or the National Review, which as many conservatives have been hating recently, actually. But if you're only listening to those sources, chances are your understanding of what a genuine liberal is believing or is saying is based on what Ben Shapiro says liberals believe, or based on what Steven Crowder or Charlie Kirk, based on what they say. And same thing for the other side. If you're just listening to the Majority Report with Sam Cedar or David Pakman, it's unlikely that your understanding of what a conservative mindset is actually coming from conservatives themselves. You're probably just listening to the caricature that is created by David Pakman or by Sam Cedar. So it's like, how do you remedy this? How do you convince people to actually listen to the other side, right? And I always say that what a lot of people have is this sort of like gut feeling that they have inside, where they really don't want to listen to someone like Vosh or Destiny, because how do we get over that? How do we convince people that the water is not that cold? It's jump in the water, it's fine. How do we convince them of that?
I mean, this is the again, the pernicious nature of oversupply of information. There's a practical reality. We only have certain amount of time, right? So we want to grab the information we want to get through a few sources. There are some platforms and sources that try their best to tread the middle ground. It's generally difficult. I think people like you and I who are interested in this kind of subject matter, we actually put an effort, and that's the thing. You have to put an effort. I tell people like me, my partner called me calendar, because I calendar everything. I've organized my day in such a like militaristic precision. I like that it gives me a certain order. I actually put in time to look at media from the other side, which is the center right. I make it a point when I buy my next audiobook, I make it a point to get a book from a conservative thinker. I make it a point to consume a little bit of just enough so I understand where they're coming from. And I make it a point to follow a few of them. And again, I don't know how well one can trick the algorithm, but I make it a point to, interact with some of the content from the center right, Ben Shapiro's, etc. So I get a little bit enough of that. But at the same time, I do the same with the left. I mean, I am a little... I tend to do more than an average person, purely because now I have a political film. So last year or so, I've been consuming a ton of political content from both the far right to the far left to the middle. But I think one of the things you can do is to make a conscious effort. If you care about this subject matter, you owe it to yourself to put at least once a week, take an hour and watch something. I cannot stand Tucker Carlson. I think he's intellectually dishonest, but I do put an effort once a week to watch what he has to say, because he has the largest audience for a talk show of his kind in America, and people genuinely get information from him. And unless you hear that, you don't understand why people get so worked out about certain things that you think, oh, there's nothing much here, but you have to put an effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's well said. And even with someone like Tucker Carlson, whom I'm not a particularly big fan of either, and there's leaked recordings out there that say that he's probably actually lying about being a sort of right-wing working class populist. But even if that's the case, millions of people watch him. And even if he doesn't believe what he's saying, millions of people do. So you can get an idea of what these people actually believe, what they stand for, his fans, that is. What are your thoughts on... Oh, go ahead. You're going to say something?
No, I was going to say, look, what you got to understand, and I've worked this out many years ago, most people who have a position like Tucker have created a character. So Tucker Carlson you see on TV is not Tucker Carlson outside of his show. He's definitely there's enough evidence to suggest it's a very different person. He's putting on a character. But as you put it, that character reaches many millions of people weekly. Anyway, you were going to ask something. Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things, before we completely leave the idea of the far left, because I do want to touch on the far right just a bit. One of the things that I'm very interested in is this concept of identity politics, where identity politics has become increasingly the game that the far left, and even at this point, just the general left, play. And so my stance on this has always been that there must be some objective metric that we can sort of recognize, and it is that objective metric that we should aim for, rather than just bypassing that thing altogether. But I do think there's some credence to the argument that if you are of a particular race, and that race tends to gravitate towards a particular argument, the likelihood that you will move towards that argument increases. So this is just basically tribalism, group mentality wrapped into one. What is your stance on identity politics? Do you think there's some validity in the argument that that someone like Robin DiAngelo will say that without identity politics, Black people would have never been given equal rights, or women would have never been given suffrage? What are your thoughts on these sorts of arguments, and what is your general view on identity politics?
Look, I don't tend to say identity politics is a zero-sum game, and I know people say that. There is something to be said about a lived experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is objectively a metric that you can apply for an entire group of people. I give this example, a real-life example. In Australia, we have some of the toughest immigration laws in the world, and we are currently holding a family of 4, including 2 children, I think they're 7 and 8, in a detention camp for over 1,000 days. I believe it's like $20 or $30 million spent just to prove a point. The immigration minister is holding this family. There are a lot of, America has a lot of cruel things with immigrants, but Australia we do far worse things over here. But the reason I'm mentioning this is most of the policymakers have a limited or no understanding of most of these immigrants that they vehemently oppose or vilify. And as an immigrant myself, I realized this when I spoke to when I have many conversations. I've gone through my, almost 2 decades fight with the immigration office. One thing is very clear: when you don't understand the lived experience of certain group of people, you tend to just look at them through a lens of numbers and claims that you have been given beforehand through, whether it's through your education, whether it popular belief, biases, etc., and then you make decisions on behalf of those people without getting that true understanding. So this is the same as if you were to, policymakers making decisions about a community without understanding the community. This is like the British when they drew the lines to separate countries. in Africa without really understanding, what are the differences between these groups and what will happen if I do this, because they just didn't have an understanding of that. So to get that understanding, I think an identity of a group of people, and their culture is important. But I do agree, some people take this as, by being that, being part of that identity is somehow alleviates them from any criticism of any kind. Right? There's this argument that black people or brown people can't be racist because you have redefined racism to be something different to what racism used to be in the dictionary, or as the English language explains it. That, I think, is serving no one. Is just adding to the existing chaos, and it gives undue power to a group of people for no intellectual reason. Like it doesn't progress anything. It just makes a group of feel superior because they have historically being inferior, or they're perceived to be inferior, and they're now like, it's our turn now.
Yeah, and as you said, whereas the left sort of tries to change the meaning of words, or sorry, not the left, the far left.
Far left, yes. It's important we make that distinction because, again, we don't want to make. I consider myself center left in almost every socio-political, economical outlooks. So yes, far left.
Yes, same here. I'm very much on the left myself. So people on the far left, they tend to change the definitions of words. They try to change the intellectual landscape in a way that prioritizes a person's identity rather than any scientific mechanism that we could use to determine what is and is not true. What the far right does is that they're still playing by the same rules of evidence. In fact, they'll say that we have evidence for these QAnon conspiracies that are going on, or we have evidence of the fact that Bill Gates is going to chip you. But what they seem to do is they're playing by the same rules, and yet the conclusions that they're reaching are insane. Like, I'm willing to say that the claim of voter fraud is pretty much insane given what we know as of right now. And yet they have the president that they all overwhelmingly want in the White House is there, and they're doing their best to make sure that he stays there for another 4 years. So now how do we tackle the far right, where we've said our due about the far left? But what about the far right, which I would argue is even though I focus more on the far left because I'm in the academy and I see them everywhere, so I feel like I'm much more familiar with them, I would say the far right is just more dangerous, quantifiably speaking. So how do we tackle them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid claim. Far right pretends to play by certain rules. They use terms like evidence, free speech. But ultimately, their ideology fails because what grounds them is not an objective reality. So the way to tackle is, I mean, you're right. They're sometimes harder to tackle because they also use similar tactics to the far left, because they will overwhelm you with pseudo evidence. It's not really evidence. They'll present it like real evidence, but it would be such a large quantity of this nonsensical evidence. It takes an enormous amount of time for you to just spend some time on it to figure out, is this even, remotely plausible? Yeah. The way to tackle this is, I think, we have a responsibility to elevate people like you who are trying to walk the middle path and taking information from all sides and making, grounding the final conclusions on Enlightenment values and objective truths. And we need to popularize this. Both far right and far left have done a fantastic job of, loudly speaking and really screaming and getting attention. We need to change that. The only way to tackle this is I mean, what we shouldn't do is constantly calling people idiots or racist or just belittling them. I don't know, if you've ever know somebody who changed their mind because somebody called them a racist. Like, that's not how the human condition. Like, it doesn't. If somebody calls me that, that doesn't make me want to further the conversation. I'll be like, first reaction is I'm going to be defensive, and I'm going to be offended, and I'm going to stop talking to you. If that's your first reaction. So we need to stop doing that. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're giving anyone from the far right a pass. You are right. If you look at the FBI data and around the world, there is an enormous rise in far right activism and armed organizations. They're using very similar tactics to the jihadist and Islamist. So it is important we try and educate the public about what they're doing. But we can't do it in a way that is just name calling and labeling them as this one group. Trump is a manifestation of many years of this kind of labeling people and just name calling people and just sort of marginalize. It's what's so weird about Trumpism is he's speaking to a marginalized group of people, and they absolutely adore him for that, but they're not considered a marginalized group of people from the idea from the left, because that's not traditionally what you call a marginalized group of people. But for the far right, I think the best thing to do is to there are some people within the right, the center right, who don't want to do anything with the furthest right. We need to elevate those people. We need to engage more with people who are willing to have reasonable conversations. We need to popularize them. We need to put some of those ideas, some of those intellectual thinking into the mainstream. Like if any of your listeners, if you haven't read the stuff from Thomas Sowell, I only discovered him a few years ago. I disagree fundamentally with regards to his position on climate change, because I don't think he has a really keen understanding of it. He has a surface level understanding of it, but then his economic explanations, I've never thought of some of those things. I'm reading one of his books now, and this is the kind of thing we should normalize. Mm-hmm. That's how I think that's how we can then when you talk to the far right, you can use some of their own heroes to break their arguments down, mm-hmm. which I've done more than once.
Oh, has effectively?
Well, that's what they told me. Yeah, I mean, I have a friend of mine who is he's from India. He supports the BJP movement. Part of BJP's origins is loosely based on the SS. So he has quite a right-wing, further right approach to it. It's ironic he's a brown man. But we've had many conversations, and I presented certain arguments from William Buckley and Thomas Sowell, and he agreed with it. But then I pointed out, by agreeing, you're more or less disagreeing with your earlier point, mm-hmm. and then he had to concede, and that definitely gave him pause. And I pointed out that's very close to what somebody in the center right would say about the same thing. You just never thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the people I've managed to anger the most on Twitter actually have been right-wing Hindu nationalists. That's yeah. Been the strangest thing that's ever occurred to me in 2020. But anyways, the final thing I want to ask you, Mr. Amila, is where can people help fund and support the documentary? When and where do you think it's going to be released, and what are your future prospects?
So please go to betterleftunsaidfilm.com. We are still raising a little bit of funds to get this film distributed. I want to distribute this independently. I learned a lot from working with the Sony Corporation last time around. I don't want to do that again. So if you think that films like this help, please help the filmmakers. It is not a lucrative industry. I'm doing this because I believe in it. This is not a how I become a millionaire, but it helps the filmmakers if we can at least make the money we spend back. So go to betterleftsunsaidfilm.com. I'm on Twitter. Desh Amila at Desh Amila is my Twitter handle. You can connect with me. But for the purposes of this conversation, watch my old film, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. It's available for free on Amazon Prime now. And thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to speak with you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for giving me the honor to be able to interview you. And all the links to everything that you said will be in the description of the video below. Mr. Amila, thanks so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Great. Thank you so much. Take care.